Ready to get it rocking and rolling. Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. I was telling our video audience, kind of in our sort of show before the show a moment ago, that feels like it's been forever since I've sat here in this chair and done the show in sort of a traditional way. It sort of seems like we did 2 million shows in New Orleans. Probably wasn't quite that many, but it certainly seems that way. We had Christmas prior to that. So it's fun today to be able to sort of settle in and kind of do the show the way we've done it before. And the overall theme for me today is going to be this. I'm in a lot better mood about Georgia now than I was a couple of days ago. I mean, I was devastated after the Sugar Bowl. I mean, just devastated. And I think many of you probably were too. And, you know, the feelings of a loss like that, it lingers. And there are some big questions to be asked about Georgia on the other side of that. I don't deny that. And yet, overall, I'm a lot more optimistic about the future now than I would have, say, maybe been as we were getting ready to leave New Orleans. I'm going to try to lay the groundwork for that and talk about why that is. And obviously, a couple of pieces of interesting transfer news from Georgia yesterday add to that discussion. We'll get into that. We'll also do our part to kind of pay tribute to the life of Sonny Smart, the really legendary Georgia high school coach that was also the father of Kirby Smart. Clearly, we've mourned and shared sadness alongside the Smart family with that here this weekend. So we'll talk about that a bit. Jon Stinchcomb is going to join us on the show today, too. A lot to kind of get into with Jon, including what happened with the Georgia offensive line against Notre Dame. Jon will certainly be a very cogent voice on all of that. So what do you say we get ready to get it all started? We're glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Those of us who are Georgia fans had to confront some sadness this weekend when we found out that Sonny Smart, the father of Kirby Smart, had passed away, you know, after kind of taking a fall in New Orleans there for the Sugar Bowl. And I think we were all kind of forced to reckon with just how complicated a week that turned out to be for Kirby and UGA, with Mr. Smart dealing with what he was dealing with. Obviously, the tragedy that was unfolding just a couple of blocks from where the Georgia team hotel was. And so that's a lot. That's a very heavy topic. In a few minutes here, we're going to do our part, I think, to very hopefully appropriately and properly pay tribute to Sonny Smart and what he meant to Kirby. Kirby's been good enough throughout the years to talk about that a little bit. We're going to give you something, I think, kind of special on that here coming up in a moment. And, you know, I'll share some thoughts about that at the time, about what I've always sort of found inspiring about the Smart family. We're going to get to that here coming up in a little bit. We know how difficult this time has been for Kirby. Well, at least we have strong assumptions about that. And so we'll kind of do our part to discuss that here in a moment. We also know this, that Smart's competitive fire doesn't burn any less bright during moments like that. He's still going to be working hard and doing his thing to kind of get Georgia, on the track for improvement in 2025 and kind of get back in that national championship picture and be just as driven to succeed as he ever was. We have examples of that from yesterday. And so before we kind of get to the stuff involving Mr. Smart, let me also talk about Zachariah and Zachariah Branch choosing Georgia yesterday. High-profile transfer portal wins for UGA. Zachariah, a very well-known wide receiver. Zachariah Branch, a guy that has not played as much defensive back there at USC, but there are a lot of people who seem to like him a lot. And let me kind of use the Branch story here for a moment to say this. After Georgia lost to Notre Dame the other day, I was devastated. I mean, as both a fan of this team who wants to see Georgia win, but also I really love covering the college football playoff. You know, I really, really enjoy it. And there's nothing worse when you sort of get tapped on the shoulder and said it's time to go home. You don't get to travel to the next destination. You don't get to do the next thing. You got to go home and watch this on TV like everybody else does. Like, there's something about that that's just disappointing. You want to be the main relevant story in college football. And for the next few days, it's going to be like Penn State and Notre Dame and Texas and Ohio State to get all the chatter. And Georgia has to sort of recede in the background with, the other programs that are, sort of forced to watch this on TV, Georgia becomes one of those. And I don't like that feeling. As a fan, I don't like when my favorite team loses. As someone who kind of does a show for a living, I would much rather be doing shows at the end of this week from South Florida than right here in the studio, because you want to be kind of where the action is. And for now, Georgia's not in that situation. However, there's something interesting about coming back home. You travel back home, you kind of get kind of back in your own friendly confines here a little bit. And I would say that some of this is just sort of the natural progression of human emotion, but I kind of find myself shaking off the massive disappointment of a loss. There's still some lingering disappointment, and we'll talk about some of that on the show today. But I kind of find myself shaking off the sort of massive disappointment. And I got to tell you, as we begin a brand new year and kind of look ahead at what the next few months are going to look like and getting ready for the 2025 season in sort of a way too early style right now, I got to tell you, I have what I believe is a true, authentic, genuine optimism. And some of y'all may not be quite there yet, and I totally understand that. Everybody sort of processes things in their own way. And when you look at kind of what the Notre Dame loss and the Sugar Bowl showed about Georgia, I think it sets us up for a pretty big conversation. I really, really do. Because there's no shortage of things you might say need some improvement. And perhaps there's no shortage of blame that needs to go around for why some of that stuff was as deficient as it was. I promise you that over the course of the next few days, over the course of the next few weeks, next few months, we're not going to sidestep any of that. I promise you we're going to try to have as open and as candid a conversation as we possibly can about why Georgia wasn't really in the national championship picture this year. They're clearly not the best team in the country. And what it's going to take to sort of get them back into that discussion for the future. We're going to try to be as open and honest as we can. But if you will allow me to sort of lay the groundwork for how that discussion is going to go in the future, let me just give you one simple point to kind of, I guess, build on as we kind of get into the more complicated topics in the upcoming days. I really believe that Georgia has the potential of fixing all of this and being much better next year, especially on the side of the ball that was probably the biggest problem this year on offense. I really believe there is a chance that Georgia can be a much better offense next season than they were this past season in 2024, and we'll try to talk about why some of that is. But let's start with the big news from yesterday. Zachariah and Zion Branch. Zachariah is a wide receiver, also a dynamic kick returner. Zion Branch is a defensive back. I guess we'll call him a safety. Both these guys coming to Georgia. Now, because of the NIL world we live in now, I think transfers get handled a little bit differently than they used to. It used to be that, like, transfers almost happen under the cover of darkness, and some guy comes in, and you don't really hear from him until much, much later. But now all these guys are sort of openly repped by agents. Agents kind of work back channels with media. They've kind of got their reporters they kind of, feed stuff to. And so we have already gotten quotes from both Zachariah and Zion Branch about coming to Georgia in a way we never would have gotten a couple of years ago. The whole world of sort of player movement just sort of functions differently than it used to. And so we've gotten quotes on the record by both Zachariah and Zion Branch. I think if you're a Georgia fan, you're going to really like these quotes from both these guys. Let me show you Zachariah Branch first, as quoted by Pete Thamel from ESPN. Zachariah saying, "I chose Georgia because I felt like the culture was something special. They have a great coaching staff, the brotherhood within the program, their will to win, being prepared for the next level, and being as successful as possible on and off the field. That was important to me." Now, listen, I realize that, these are quotes that are probably sort of written and rewritten and kind of edited over and over again. I realize there's probably a team of people that sort of helped choose these words for Zachariah. I'm not, going to be naive about that. But nonetheless, if you're a Georgia fan, you like that quote, right? That's what you want people to say, I got to say, if he's choosing UGA. That's what you want, right? And so I think if you're a Georgia fan, you're kind of, maybe familiarizing yourself with Zachariah Branch. We can take that down now. I think that if you're familiarizing yourself with Zachariah Branch, saying that kind of thing about why you chose Georgia, I think that's kind of what you want to hear. And obviously right now, for a lot of Georgia fans, they are examining what Zachariah brings to the table. I think he's a really exciting, dynamic player. Now, I will admit, a lot of that enthusiasm I have about Zachariah comes from some of the stuff that he did at the very beginning of his college career. He's been in college now for 2 years. The very beginning of his college career, first couple of games, this guy was like a revelation. He was like putting touchdowns all over the place. For whatever reason, I he hasn't quite matched that since then, either in 2023 or for the most part in 2024. I won't pretend that I know exactly why that is. I will say this, though, that in almost every situation when a player is available in the transfer portal, it wasn't perfect at his previous stop. Otherwise, he wouldn't be transferring. So in any situation where a guy's transferring, there's almost always going to be some sort of inefficiency of, well, this wasn't quite as good as it could have been. If that wasn't the case, he'd still be right where he was. So, you're going to hear some stuff about Zachariah Branch. In fact, we even have some USC fans that have kind of been a part of our comment section for a long time just because we've been around for a while, and I guess big audience people just sort of gravitate towards us. And, they were talking yesterday about, drops and some of that stuff or some of those issues. Look, I mean, there's always going to be some of that with fans when a player leaves. And in the case of Branch, there probably are some fair questions to ask about, well, how come the statistical profile didn't quite match what we think is a prodigious talent level, and how come the beginning of the college career is so different than what the last couple of years have been? Those are probably all fair questions to ask. But, man, I love the dynamic nature of his athleticism. And I do believe that this is the kind of player that Georgia has the potential of doing something really interesting with. In fact, the point that I made yesterday when Connor Riley and I were on video talking about all of this is, and maybe this is a dumb thing to say, maybe y'all will one day laugh at me for saying this, even though Dane Key, the receiver from Kentucky, much better numbers than Zachariah Branch, I'm actually more excited about Georgia getting Branch than I would be about Georgia getting Key, just because what I've seen from Branch when I've watched him on TV is a really electrifying athlete. And that's the kind of thing I think Georgia needs as much of as it can get. Body style, Key sort of fits that, I guess, the X style, the big body receiver style. Georgia probably needs that too. But we also saw a situation against Notre Dame where Georgia receivers are having a hard time creating separation for themselves. And someone who just brings the athleticism of Branch, it seems like he might be able to create that open space that makes catches and conversions a little easier to come by for Georgia. So I really like Branch a lot. Of all the players that have been available in the transfer portal for me, this might be the name I've been the most interested in, and now he's coming to UGA. The other thing to note here is sometimes it's who you're competing with that gives you an idea of how valuable the player is. The overall stat line for Branch, it's not eye-popping, but, man, you had schools like Tennessee and Texas also trying to go down to the wire with Georgia to win with Zachariah Branch. So pretty clearly, Georgia not the only program to put a big valuation on him because, Tennessee and Texas, two pretty heavy hitters within the SEC, were seemingly going after him too. Now, also Zion Branch, who I have to be totally honest, I didn't really know much about until this whole portal thing sort of started here. Zion Branch is also coming to Georgia along with his brother Zachariah, and this is a guy that seems to sort of fit that position of need for Georgia. They've been out there looking for safeties. Branch did not play a lot at USC, but it sounds like this is a guy that is certainly ready to break out and play for somebody, and now we'll get a chance to do that here at Georgia. He also had an interesting quote given to ESPN2 about why he wanted to come to Georgia. He says, in 2025, I see Georgia continuing its legacy as one of the most dominant programs in college football. This team is poised to do something truly special, competing for championships and setting a standard of excellence that few can match. With the talent that's already there and the elite level recruits coming in, the future is incredibly bright. So, once again, if you're a Georgia fan, I think you really like that quote from Zion Branch as much as you like the quote from Zachariah Branch. They clearly are saying all the right things about coming into Georgia, and I'm curious about the opportunity to learn more about Zion and how he could fit into a situation at Georgia where there's pretty obvious a need at safety. We assume that Malachi Stark is on his way to the NFL, and Zion Branch is going to have a real chance to play here and compete alongside others. As far as like what, Zachariah and Zion, or let me stick with the Zachariah part of this for a moment. As far as what we know, what else Zachariah Branch brings to the table here, this is not a guy that's necessarily expected to, kind of come in and be the number one receiver for Georgia, be the most important offensive player in this program for Georgia. That's not really what he's expected to come in and do. He's expected to come in and make a contribution alongside others. And some of that's going to be the incredibly talented players that Georgia just signed the 2025 class. Some of that's going to be guys who are choosing to stay here at Georgia and work and develop and get better. Some of that may be an additional transfer name that Georgia still brings in. That the collection of receivers that Georgia has is going to come from a lot of different sources, whether it be players who've been here, players who are also transferring here, players who were recruited here. And the mixture of some of those guys that you bring in out of high school with the occasional transfer that you add in, that may be the most, I guess, potent mix for talent in that position group here right now. In fact, you remember the other day for a media day, we were doing our show live, kind of going around the sort of the banquet hall there in New Orleans. While we were doing that, Kirby Smart was talking the entire time. We have like a 45-minute press conference with him up on our DawgNation YouTube page that perhaps you missed because there was so much going on leading in the Sugar Bowl. But you can go watch the whole thing. Some of it's kind of awkward because, I don't know, just for a lot of reasons. But there was one moment when Kirby was kind of asked about this position, the one that Zachariah plays, the wide receiver position. And he had some interesting things to say about how transfers sort of mix in with guys you bring in from high school, the fact that you got to have some transfers, but at the same time, you probably don't want solely transfer players either. This is sort of a revealing statement from Kirby Smart from last week. Take a listen to this.
No, we have to take them out of the portal. It's forced us to take more, not less, because the maturity level that you bring in has to be ready to go on the field. That's not always the case in high school. I would love to be able to take high school kids, bring them straight in, grow them, have them ready to play, but that's not always the case. We've probably taken fewer guys out of the portal than any top team in the country. But I don't know that you can say taking high school kids replaces a kid that's a sophomore, junior, senior in your room. Because I don't think anybody wants to line up next year with 6 freshmen in that room and nobody else. So what you end up doing is you take some maturity. You take a older, more physical kid who's played some football out of the portal, and then you grow your high school roster.
I'm running long here. I've got so much I want to say. Let me see if I can try to sum all this up kind of quickly. I think what Smart says there is kind of interesting that, hey, you don't want to be relying solely on a bunch of young wide receivers. If you can mix those in with a transfer player who's played and gotten a couple of years worth of experience, that's what you want to do, and that's what the addition of a guy like Zachariah Branch has a chance to do. But let me also kind of consider this here for a moment. Whether it be one of the freshmen you sign out of the 2025 class or a transfer you bring in or a guy that's been here, somehow, some way, you got to find kind of that game-changing pass-catching target again. At Georgia, you just have to do that. You know, we spent almost all year leading into this season saying, well, how's Georgia going to replace a Brock Bowers? How are they going to replace a Ladd McConkey? As it turns out, with this team here in 2024, they just kind of didn't. There wasn't really anybody who was that reliable, who could make something look easy because you could just dump it off to him over and over and over again. And in 2025, they got to fix that. You know, to be better next season, you got to get that back. You got to have that in this program. But I really do, as I open the show today by saying, I'm sort of optimistic that could happen. And in fact, let me just lay this out briefly, and then we'll get more into this in the days to come. If you look at the Smart era at Georgia, there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There have been 7 Georgia skill position guys, either, running back, wide receiver, tight end. 7 skill position guys taken in the first 2 rounds of the NFL draft. Nick Chubb, Sonny Michel, McCole Hardman, DeAndre Swift, George Pickens, Brock Bowers, Ladd McConkey. 7 of those guys. Any one of those 7, had they played for Georgia against Notre Dame, probably wins the game for Georgia, right? Better performance running back, better performance from a pass catcher, certainly a Brock Bowers. Any of those guys would have potentially changed the game. But if you really think about it, I think the chance exists that Georgia could have somebody that sort of functions like one of those guys next season from one of the talent pools that Georgia has available for itself. For instance, look at running back here for a moment. We don't really know what Trevor Etienne's going to do. Let's just sort of put him aside for a moment. Let's just look at Nate Frazier. This year, Nate Frazier, as a freshman, had 671 yards and 8 touchdowns. Now, that doesn't quite compare to like Nick Chubb's freshman season when he was kind of a historic player, but those are better numbers than what Sonny Michel and DeAndre Swift had when they were freshmen. So is it possible that Nate Frazier could be the next Sonny Michel or DeAndre Swift here at Georgia? I think that's pretty realistic. And showing some of that next year in 2025 is quite possible. So if Nate Frazier is on his way to having a Michel or Swift type of career at Georgia, taking that next step in 2025, how much better does that potentially make the Georgia offense? That's realistic. That's not pie in the sky thinking. That's a realistic thing that could occur. And plus, when you look at the receivers who've kind of broken through, the pass catchers who've kind of broken through and been sort of top 2-round NFL talents, Mecole Hardman was a player who was here and developed. George Pickens was a 5-star, sort of good from the start. Ladd McConkey was the sort of dime in the rough you kind of found not really knowing what you had in him. Well, think about all the guys that Georgia just brought in this class of 2025. If Pickens could be that, could Talon Taylor maybe be that for Georgia? If Ladd McConkey was a guy that sort of emerged out of nowhere when you didn't really know what you had, are there potentially some diamonds in the rough, from that 2025 class who could maybe do the same type of thing? If a guy like Mecole Hardman had been here, developed, kind of starting on defense, moving to offense, then sort of became something really big at Georgia, is there perhaps a player on this Georgia roster who's sort of also been working while he's waiting, and he has a chance to do some of that? And it's sort of the best example of all of kind of dynamic Georgia players, Brock Bowers, who's a legend, an all-time great at the college level and probably on his way to being that at the NFL level too. The truth is, while he was a top-flight recruit, coming out of high school, I don't know that anyone would have necessarily guaranteed based on that profile that he was on his way to being one of the 3 or 4 greatest players this program's ever had. There's also the chance, not quite next Brock Bowers necessarily, but there's also a chance that another one of these 2025 signees could at least provide some potential for a similarly pleasant surprise. In other words, to sort of sum all this up, in the days and weeks to come, we're going to talk about what needs to be fixed with Georgia. We're going to be open to it all, whether it be players, coaches, decisions, anything like that. We're going to take it all head on. But to sort of begin that discussion and begin our year, let me just say that I'm pretty optimistic right now. I think there's some real potential for the Georgia offense to be better next season. Zachariah Branch's arrival is sort of part of that. The guys they're bringing in the class of 2025, that's a big part of that too. Guys who've been here may get even better next year. That's a part of that there as well. If you look at the best offensive players that have existed for Georgia during the Kirby Smart era and try to find guys on this current upcoming roster, at least similar in profile to that, I think you'll be happy with what you see. I think you'll be starting to be more excited about some improvement you might see from this offense here in 2025. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We're glad to have you with us. We are running so late today, like shockingly late, so we got to pick up the pace here a little bit. But I don't want to shortchange our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia because they don't shortchange you. We are about to have incredibly cold weather, and I'm talking about shockingly cold, right? You've heard about that maybe. And when you think about really, really cold weather, I want you to think about the windows in your house. Because did you know this? To be honest with you, I didn't know this. But did you know that, when it comes to your heating bill and how much you're sort of paying for all that about 30% of the energy in your home sort of exits out of your home because of your windows. So if you've got, properly sealed windows or just sort of old, I guess they're thinner or whatever, if you have, sort of older windows that perhaps need to be replaced, think about all the energy that you're wasting. When it's 10 degrees outside, get the heat cranked up, a bunch of that heat's just shooting right out of your house into the cold air on the outside because the windows you have aren't keeping it on the inside where it's supposed to be. So this is where Pella windows kind of come into play here because they have the double pane, some cases the triple pane windows. They have these really technologically advanced products that keep that energy on the inside of your house where it's supposed to be. All of a sudden now, you're not spending as much on your heating bills anymore. These windows literally kind of help pay for themselves over the course of time because of what they do to kind of make your home feel good on the inside. When you get that heating bill, kind of look a lot better on paper because of the fact that you're not wasting energy perhaps the way you would have in the past. That's a big reason why it's time for you to talk to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia about all that. It's not a pressure consultation. They want to simply educate you on this. If you just heard me in my kind of sort of a dumb way try to explain this to you, I promise you, the Pella folks are so much better at explaining how much money you have a chance to save, why the Pella product is viewed to be the best. All of that, they have a chance to explain and show all that to you in a lot more efficient manner than I just did. So I want you to find them online. It's PellaGA.com/DawgNation. That's PellaGA.com/DawgNation. You can also give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. There's great savings right now, too. Between now and the end of the month, January 30th, you can get $500 off a Pella project and 0% APR for 24 months. So you can take advantage of that. but also you can just have a great experience taking the best possible care of the thing that probably matters to you most, which is your home. Be sure you tell them that BA from DawgNation Daily sent you, because I know they'll take good care of you. One more time, it's PellaGA.com/DawgNation, or call them 678-638-1429. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is going beyond. All right, so we got Jon Stinchcomb here coming up in a moment. Let me also right now get ready to go around the doghouse poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. I was going to do some transfer stuff here. Let me kind of push that. We'll do that with Jon Stinchcomb here in a moment. Instead, let me focus in on the incredibly sad story from the weekend that Kirby Smart's father, Sonny Smart, who a lot of folks have known separate from his son Kirby as longtime high school coach in Georgia, really a pillar of the sport for a long time down at Bainbridge High School, where Kirby Smart himself graduated from. And, you know, if you've been a close observer of Georgia football for a long time, you've seen, Kirby's parents on hand. There's a lot of great photos of and video of Kirby and Mr. Smart together. And obviously this weekend, after having taken a fall in New Orleans, Sonny Smart passed away. And in a moment, I'm going to let you hear Kirby talking about the influence that his father had on him. This is something our guy Cody Chaffins did a really good job with. And, obviously Cody's a great shooter and a great, like a videographer, a great, just cameraman and somebody that does a good job with that. But there's also something to be said for like archiving things well and kind of holding on to good pieces of video and clips and things like that. And I think in moments like this, we're glad to have stuff like that of Kirby sharing thoughts about his father and kind of what he's meant to him. And I will tell you that for me personally, one of the things I've always been moved by is, Kirby is as driven to succeed as anybody possibly can be. And yet in the midst of all of that, with our own eyes, without really knowing him personally, we're also able to see how much family means to Kirby too. His parents seemingly always around for every game. We see Kirby's children, especially his son Andrew. He's just the one you sort of notice the most, but his twins too, always kind of around for all of that. Like, this is a guy that, the best that we can tell, isn't doing one thing to shortchange his family while he also works tirelessly on behalf of the organization that he's building here, Georgia football. And I've always found that incredibly meaningful. I really have. I think just something that speaks to a lot of us. And going back to, I believe this is in L.A. for the national championship prior to the game against TCU, Kirby talked about having his parents around, his father in particular, and the way in which his father, Sonny Smart, had been an influence on him. This is really good stuff, and I think in a very appropriate remembrance of a guy who made a major impact on someone who most of us certainly love cheering for. This is Kirby Smart talking about his father, Sonny, from a couple of years ago.
He's been at almost every game in terms of home games that we've had in Athens and, playoff games. So it's tough that he's not able to make it, and, nothing worse than, watching your parents grow old. And it's like taxes. It's inevitable they're going to get old. And that's been tough. But he taught me so much just about the way you handle things, the right way, the wrong way, control the controllables. The moment's never too big if you're prepared. And I always watched the way he prepared our teams and our staff in high school. And he was a very wise man and man of few words. And I try to follow his mantra as a coach. And I've certainly evolved from going to coach for other people, but a lot of my core beliefs come from the way he ran our programs in high school.
There's something so real about that. I tell you, so many of us of a similar age to Kirby, we've had our own experience with our parents, my wife's parents, my father. Many of you sort of tell those same stories. And, as Kirby says, man, to watch these people who have been pillars in our lives get older is just incredibly sad. It's hard. And I think a lot of us, probably because of the way in which Kirby, the money makes and things like that, we sort of feel like we don't really have any kind of sort of, I guess, personal connection, or we don't really understand a lot about him maybe necessarily. But in a situation like this, I mean, his life is no different than the rest of ours. And, all the fame and all the money and stuff like that doesn't insulate him from the same things that we deal with, which is the fact that, the people that you love, they just get older. And as I said before, I've always found it incredibly inspiring how Kirby has shown the value of family in his life while at the same time working harder than anybody we could ever imagine. You know, a lot of us have this feeling. I'll be quick about this, but a lot of us have this feeling where you're at work and you're sort of worried about whether or not you're doing enough for your family. And then you're at home with your family and you're worried about if you're doing enough at work. Have you ever had that feeling before? There's just a tension. And it is not an easy thing. Listen, I don't care what anybody says. That is not an easy thing to resolve, about being at work thinking, am I doing enough for my family? Being at home and thinking, did I take care of business at work? That is just a really, really stressful thing. And Kirby Smart has always, I think, kind of shown the way in which no matter how hard you work, it's good to have your parents around. And no matter how hard you work, it's good to have your kids around. And no matter how hard you work, let's make sure that we don't shortchange the people in our life, the generation before us, the generation after us. Let's make sure we don't shortchange that. I think that to the best that I can tell, Kirby's gotten that right about as well as anybody could. Obviously, I'm not behind closed doors or whatever, but just in terms of the public-facing part of that, I don't know that you could do a better job with that than what Kirby seems to be doing, given how driven to succeed he obviously is. And so I can't help but think about the way in which we have all of these ever-present visuals of the Smart family around Georgia football, both his parents and now his own children too. And so I know how much he must be hurting today. Obviously, any of us who've lost a parent can sort of speak to that. So as sincerely as we're capable of, we send prayers to Kirby and his family, and I hope he feels that. I really do. I know that Kirby goes around understanding just how much attention he always gets, and the sheer size of the Georgia fan base and the media that serves that fan base covering Georgia is almost overwhelming. When you're in New Orleans, you're just blown away by how many people cover Georgia and how much of an audience eats all of that up. And I'm sure if you're Kirby Smart, that must feel personally overwhelming too. I can only imagine it must. But I hope in moments like this, he feels just how sincerely people care for him and hurt with him today. I hope he feels that. I believe that he probably does. So I'm sure you'll join me with offering your sincere prayers on all of that. Now, no easy way to transition from that to Around the Doghouse, but I do want to thank Dr. Pepper for being a part of that. I certainly appreciate we had a great time in our DawgNation vase, and our friends from Dr. Pepper were on hand for that. Our guy Jonathan does such a great job of setting all that up. We had the big Dr. Pepper, cans out there filled with the little cans of Dr. Pepper, and obviously the touchdown toss stuff. They had that set up there too. All of that really very good. So they always do a great job. Big part of the college football scene. Big part of the Sugar Bowl there too. So that was always a lot of fun. We appreciate Dr. Pepper bringing Around the Doghouse to us here today on DawgNation Daily. All right, I am so beyond late. I mean, just shockingly late. So let me apologize to my friend Jon Stinchcomb, but we'll try to make good use of his time and, of course, yours here as we kind of keep the conversation going about everything going on with Georgia football here right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let me say hello to Jon Stinchcomb. We always appreciate his time. Of course, holiday season over with now, so no more Christmas tree as a backdrop there. Jon kind of back in his office, back to business, if you will, on all of that. Jon, I apologize for being so late in getting to you today. I really do. If you don't mind, though, let me pick up where I just was. Did you ever meet Sonny Smart? Did you know him at all? And if so, would you mind telling us a little bit about your experience with Mr. Smart?
Sure. I've met him a couple times. Obviously, he's around constantly or was. And I think that's what makes it so hard is the close relationship Kirby had with his parents, his family. And there was hardly an occasion where I would get the opportunity to be on the sideline where Coach Smart, the elder, wasn't there as well. And just there to support. And you can see the impact that he's had on Kirby. And it's a tough loss just for everyone, but especially the family. My heart goes out to them because you saw how close they were. And, the impact not only did he have as a coach and the mentor role that he played, but on the entire family. And, it's so unfortunate that, a fall ends up being the demise. And so, we all mourn for their loss.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And obviously, we have people of all different ages watching and listening to us right now. Some people younger than me, some people older than me. You and I are at least close to the same age. And I think it's interesting, a lot of the SEC coaches are also close to our age too. And so at least a good number of them right now. And you see these guys trying to be dads and sons and coaches at the same time. And you realize that they deal in sort of an interesting way with a lot of the same kind of pressure that all of us deal with. Like, you want to get it right at home, but you also want to get it right at work. And, the challenge of all that, I think, is probably pretty significant. I think all of us in our own way feel some version of that. But I've always taken comfort from the fact that, like, Kirby's family is always, like, right there in the frame. Whatever's going on with Georgia football, you see Mary Beth. You see the kids. Certainly you see Andrew a lot. You saw, Mr. and Mrs. Smart. You didn't have to look very far to see family. And so for as, like, driven as Kirby Smart is, you certainly never gotten any indication that the people in his life took a back seat in his life while he's done the things he's done as a football coach. And I've always taken, I would say, a form of inspiration from that, John.
Yes, and the job is demanding. Everyone who has seen or been a part of football teams knows the hours that coaches put in, especially those that are successful. And Kirby leads the way. I think if there was ever a concern for him, it's that he spends so much time year round on the players, not only the recruitment, but once they arrive, and just making sure that he's got his finger on the entire program and knows the pulse of it, and is leading the charge, if you will. And what we've seen in other occasions is that comes at a sacrifice of family time. And what I think he's done an exceptional job of is combining those two aspects of his life, being an exceptional coach and head of a program, but also head of a household, and welcoming and encouraging his family to be a part of every aspect of it. I think we all can agree that there's hardly an occasion where you don't look on the sideline or pregame or halftime where Andrew's not catching punts, or the first, or at least some of the first people he hugs his family at the end of a game. So I think it's a concerted effort on the entire family's part, that they don't allow that isolation. They don't allow the separation of what he does professionally and coaching a football team to come in the way of him also having some pretty significant responsibilities at home. And I think we all value and appreciate that. I'd also add that Andrew's not the only kid on the sideline.
Yeah.
It appears that has been an opportunity that's extended to the entire staff, and obviously something that's promoted, because many times it can cause such a strain on those family relationships that they end up breaking. And so I think he, one, has experienced it as a son of a coach, and two, saw ways to do it and ways that he didn't want to be a part of.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's well said. Hard to transition to, like, the normal topic, but I do want to talk about the Sugar Bowl here a little bit. We'll get to the offensive line part of this in a moment, because obviously that was, I would think, one of the bigger issues, and you're clearly an expert to kind of help us break that down. But let me start more broadly than that. What was your reaction to the fact that, Georgia lost, and frankly, Notre Dame didn't have to do very much, threw for less than 100 yards, not a spectacular performance, and yet, at least based on the final score, they won somewhat convincingly. Like, it was a disappointing day for Georgia football, breaking a long streak of wins against non-conference opponents and everything else. What was your sort of, apart from the offensive line here for a moment, and I promise you we'll get there, what was your other sort of big takeaway from just kind of what went wrong for Georgia there?
Yeah, I think it was ultimately, you can't play the type of game that Georgia ended up having against a good team, a solid team, a championship competing or level team like Notre Dame and expect to win. When you lose the turnover margin by -2, so you didn't create any turnovers, and you give up a special teams touchdown, that is usually a recipe for disaster. And I think that's what Georgia experienced. I think you also look at the number of opportunities that were created that Georgia had to kind of make an impact. Obviously, the Dillon Bell drop on the deep pass comes to mind, even though that was a drive that ended in points. There was a number of opportunities that Georgia just couldn't capitalize on. And it's unfortunate, but it's also kind of a storyline that has weaved itself through this entire season. I think Georgia was able to rebound and overcome similar type performances and similar hiccups along the way, and wasn't able to do so in the Sugar Bowl. So I don't think that was an anomaly. I think that Notre Dame is I still don't see them as like a superior opponent. I just don't think that Georgia can play the type game that they had and be able to come away with a win against a quality opponent. And obviously there's some individual performances that affected the outcome. But overall, it just wasn't a championship caliber performance from Georgia at a time where they really needed one.
And I thought the Georgia offensive line play, left tackle in particular. And listen, I'll be the first to tell you, I think Monroe Freeling has a chance to be a very good football player. I mean, I am not going to sit here and just trash Monroe, but he would be the first to tell you, too, he did not have a good game against Notre Dame, man. Like, if he were sitting here right now, he would not sugarcoat that. You know, I'm not going to trash him. We're just going to call balls and strikes. That Monroe did not have a good day at left tackle, and maybe it wasn't a good day for the Georgia offensive line in particular. And, you know, I spent a lot of time before you joined us, John, saying I'm optimistic about next year. I think Georgia's got a chance to have the playmakers and all that kind of stuff. I think the offense could be better. But this offensive line for me is a really big question right now. I thought to begin the season they'd be the best group on the team, thought they'd be the best offensive line in the country, and they just weren't for whatever reason. What do you make of what happened with the offensive line in particular and kind of the state of that position group right now for Georgia?
Yeah, underperforming. It was underwhelming just in general. You look at the season and the expectations were so high. You had so many returning starters and impact players, and then you add in some young talent that you're excited about. I think we start with, even before Monroe got the opportunity to be the starting left tackle, Ernest Green came in with some pretty high expectations based off a freshman year, the year prior, where you're saying he has a high ceiling. And there was a regression across the board. I don't think there would be a single player that felt like they reached or even met expectations across the board. And so it's disappointing, and it certainly was impactful throughout the year where you're looking at it and you're going, we've got to do better. And I think there's a great opportunity because there's a lot of talent in that room, but talent isn't always enough. The potential can be a very dirty word, and it certainly was one that ended up biting Georgia this year, in that the potential was there for this to be the cornerstone of this offense and really the team, and it was not. It was underwhelming. So it's a long off season. I know I can almost relate to Monroe because there was a year in the NFL where we're playing in a playoff game and I didn't have a great performance. And those 8 months between when you're done and when you get to take your next snap in a real game, there are long months where plays like that, like Monroe had, will haunt you. And I think it's a good motivator. It's one of those where all off season long, when you're doing those drills and you're running and you're lifting and you feel so far away from football, there's a good motivator to not experience that again. That low that he's felt won't be defining for him. Hopefully it will be motivating. And he's a talented young player that didn't have his best game, and has some things that he can correct and work on. And the good news for both of them, both Ernest Green, who you see in your picture, and Monroe Freeling, is that they have talent and they have opportunity to get a whole lot better. So it's a good way to go into the off season with a little staying in your side that you haven't had the performance that you want. You're capable of more, and you've got to put in the work to make sure that you reach those goals that you set.
I think it's really interesting, John. And the time we have left, I want to kind of run through a couple stories here of, we're in that sort of player departure season for Georgia right now, too. Obviously, Georgia found out some good news yesterday with a couple of transfers coming in. But, you've got NFL draft declarations. You've got some transfer departures. Let me start with Tate Ratledge here. He, kind of sort of says his official goodbye to Georgia. There's more of that coming. But a guy like Tate, the leadership that he provided, the good teams that had a chance to play on, this is one of those guys that I'll think be obviously remembered very fondly here at Georgia as his career comes to an end, right?
Well, I think Coach Smart said it best when he was doing his interview, and he was alongside Jalen Walker and Tate Ratledge, and was saying, despite the adversity, and I'm sure there's more behind the scenes that we even have a clue as to what they've dealt with, but to have Coach Smart stop pretty much the press conference and say, let me take a minute to recognize the impact and leadership that Jalen and Tate have had on this program, I think speaks volumes. So Tate specifically is a guy that wanted to come into this season and kind of put his stake in the ground and say, this is what we're all about. And, because of injuries and other challenges, missed games, and obviously the team fell short of what their ultimate goal was. But you look on these players fondly, and you appreciate the commitment that they had. And, Tate coming out of high school, there was other opportunities for him. And once he committed to Georgia and felt like this was the place where he could make his impact felt, I think it's been a very positive one. You look at the full body of work that this class of players, the ones that are leaving and getting ready to play in the NFL, it is remarkable. And you're grateful for the seasons that they've provided for our fan base and all of DawgNation, because they've represented our university so well.
And then Jaden Rashada announced that he's transferring again. It's been quite an adventurous couple of years for him when it comes to player movement and things like that. And I don't say that, to trash him or anything like that. But we do know that after starting some at Arizona State, he came here to get development that he thought that he needed. And while the other day when we were at Georgia practice, he threw a beautiful pass, the Colby Young catch that we've shown on video. Rashada's the guy that threw that. So he's got some talent. He's clearly a talented player, but this is not a guy that I think really was in much of a heated contest for playing time here. It seems like Ryan Puglisi was probably ahead of him on the depth chart, I believe, all things considered. Once again, that's not to trash him on the way out the door here, but Rashada came in hoping for development, and it certainly seems like his best chance at playing is probably somewhere else, and that, to my mind, is probably why he's leaving.
I would imagine so. I thought it was an interesting signing and commitment when he did decide to leave Arizona State and come here, especially looking at his course. I think it was more beneficial for him. He sees an opportunity to be a part of a program and learn behind Carson Beck. I don't think he probably came here thinking realistically that he would be able to replace him this season. But I do think he sees a championship caliber program that he could be a part of, learn from a system within a system that can improve his game, and then possibly make a decision like he has at the end of this year, which, like it or not, that's the world we live in college football, where there are some individual driven decisions, and it's frustrating for a lot of fans. You don't have the commitments and the loyalty levels that we've seen in years past. And that can be really hard for fans to buy in on, but it is the system that's in place. And there are opportunities for guys to see what's best for them. And obviously financial is a piece of that with NIL money, and development and opportunities are the next pieces that are a part of those decisions that are being made. And there's going to be some wins and there's going to be some losses. I think ultimately Georgia probably needs a few players and a few scholarships to free themselves to allow for incoming talent. Most of that's going to be from the high school ranks. I think Georgia still and will always, under Kirby Smart, value most the opportunity to get high school players that are highly sought after, develop them in-house and get those opportunities that way, and then supplement like they had. You look at the additions of the Branches from USC and you go, this is the type additions that Georgia is seeking in the transfer portal. I think they highlight a couple of position groups that they want to target and then find specific players that fit into that need category that they want to fill. And so ultimately there's going to be some loss and some attrition in this turnover from the transfer portal. I don't think that you're trying to go one for one. I don't think Georgia's looking at it going, all right, if we lose 10 players, we need to fill with 10 transfer portal players. I think there's actually some space that needs to be created for some incoming freshmen, and then supplement like Georgia has and will continue to do with specific targets that they want to fill the roster with.
And then very quickly, because I want to be respectful, you talk about one for one. It almost seems like there's a little bit of that because Georgia loses Anthony Evans, who's played some at receiver and been the punt returner. You bring in a guy like Zachariah Branch, who has probably played a little more at receiver, certainly a higher rated recruit coming out of high school, and at times has been kind of a dynamic kick returner there. Kind of an interesting trade for a guy in Evans who probably feels like it wasn't playing as much at Georgia as he'd like to. If I had to assume, that's why he's probably leaving, and I think he could leave and go and be a pretty good football player somewhere else. At a place like Georgia, some of the guys that leave are going to be good elsewhere. Evans might be. The trade here is kind of interesting because Zachariah Branch, as I said to begin our show, he does bring some stuff to the table that I think I like.
Oh, absolutely. And Anthony Evans was a good spark in the special teams. He wasn't as impactful as a receiver as I'm sure, wanted to be. And this year was probably a great opportunity for all guys to kind of look and say, there is space to create. And Georgia has always demanded wide receivers to be good blockers and willing blockers. And, that is a part of the equation. It's not just individual playmaking, but also being willing to kind of get your nose dirty and allow for opportunities for your teammates when it's their time to have the ball in their hands. And, if you're comparing, I think Zachariah Branch, what he brings to the table is a similar spark in the special teams, but also maybe potentially a little more of an upgrade as a wide receiver. It's hard to say because we never really got to see a lot of Evans line up as an offensive weapon. So I'm sure the plan when you bring Zachariah here is that not only can he provide a spark in special teams, but also be an addition in that wide receiver room. And if we're going to be candid, that's a position group that was underwhelming this year. Obviously, offensive line, there's room to improve there, but that wide receiver room, despite the additions, despite the some of the returning faces, it was never as impactful or as threatening to a defense as Georgia wanted it to be. And as a matter of fact, you look at their college football leading statistic, it's a troubling one with the number of drops that they had. And so there was obviously a need to improve that room by addition and subtraction. So we'll see some players that have already decided to leave, but you look at the incoming freshmen and some of the first 5 stars that we've seen walk into that room since George Pickens. So an area that needed a degree of excitement is getting it.
Well, speaking of that, I promise I'm going to let you go here, John. I'm not going to keep you all day. But there is breaking news coming out right here as we're discussing, and this is good news for UGA, as Christian Miller, defensive lineman, via Instagram has announced that he is returning for the 2025 season. I think that Miller's a really good player. I think he's a really important leader for this team. Getting a guy like that back for 2025, that is some good news here on a Monday.
I love it. You got breaking news,
That's
BA.
right. We're just
Well
breaking
done.
news here.
Yeah, so impactful younger player, big frame with the Nazir Stackhouse leaving. He's certainly not somebody that you want walking out the door. I think he's improved as the season went on, and I'm glad to see him back because with Jarrett walking out the door, his big body, those are few and far between. Athletic big men that can be impactful, that understand the system that Georgia runs, and it's varied. You see the variety that they present an offense, and there's a mental load on our defensive players that some folks it takes them some time to grasp. And so when you're a part of the program, understand what your role is, and then able to match your skills into that system, that's when players really excel. And so sometimes that takes a little bit of a learning curve. So young, talented player that's been a part of the system for a couple of years coming back that's exciting news for all of us.
It sure is, John. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that. I hope you and your family are off to a happy new year here in 2025, and we'll look forward to a lot of fun conversations about guys coming back, Georgia putting a good team together. I think there's a lot of reason for optimism here in 2025. There's some issues to solve, but frankly, spending time talking about that, it's kind of fun too. So we'll look forward to all those conversations in the weeks and months to come.
I'll always be it's certainly wasn't the 2024 that we were hoping for Georgia, but I think they represented us well, and look forward to an even better 2025. So always great to be a dog. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs indeed.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Do you know how many rival fans, Georgia haters, tune into a show like this today because they want to hear us squirm. They want to hear us be miserable. They want to hear us be woe is me and all the sky's falling, everything is terrible. And do you know how happy it makes me that we're not giving them that satisfaction? That for the people who tuned in to see us down bad, we don't get down bad. Admittedly, Georgia lost. That's disappointing. You got to shake it off. You got to figure it out. But there are few teams in the game that shake it off better than Georgia does. Yesterday, announcing Zachariah and Zion Branch coming to Georgia. Today, announcing Christian Miller ready to run it back. The good news never stops, and I love that. So, for those of you who saw Georgia lose, and you're so happy because your team can't win, so the best you can hope for is that Georgia won't win either. For those of you who saw Georgia lose and were so happy, and now you're sort of hoping that's the first signs of an empire in decline, a dynasty that's now crumbling. Guess what? It could just be the Georgia Bulldogs are not willing to cooperate with that particular narrative for you. Because we got some good news today. Christian Miller coming back, I think, is a really, really big deal. If you've seen the picture, I don't know. We're like, I'm just smiling like as big as possible. It's kind of funny for our story at DawgNation.com on the Miller news. That's the picture we used as what you call in the business, by the business I mean the industry, a featured image. The featured image is like me. So I'm on the cover of DawgNation.com right now with the news that Christian Miller's coming back. So that is very funny stuff. And to Mr. Miller, I am certainly glad that he's returning. One of the best interviews we had at Media Day the other day was with Christian Miller. So perhaps foreshadowing this good news right here. Yeah, there it is from Miller's Instagram. Says, I'm coming back, but this time I'm coming for everything. So there you go. Georgia haters, beware. Georgia haters, be warned. Christian Miller coming back with bad intentions on his mind. And for those of you who want to see Georgia down bad, there you go. Look at that. That's the cover of DawgNation.com right now. Featured, by the way, you talk about like Inception. How about me watching a video of me currently doing the show? This is confusing. If you're not watching a video, you have no idea what we're talking about. But we just showed a screenshot of DawgNation.com while we were talking. That was the photo of me interviewing Miller, the big smile on my face. Christian making me laugh. And below that was our show live on video. So I was literally watching myself on video do the show on video. I'm surprised the internet didn't explode on part of that. But anyway, so that's good news, fun stuff. And speaking of fun stuff, let's go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. We're like right there at it. Showtime, go time for our DawgNation cruise here in 2025. So many folks excited about being on board Utopia of the Seas for all of that, and really excited about a brand new year of great things coming for Royal Caribbean, particularly in Port Canaveral. I was telling this to somebody when we were in New Orleans. One of the things I love about Royal Caribbean is they're obviously dedicated to new ships and fun things and all that kind of stuff. But in particular, one of the things they've really made a very big push for is like Port Canaveral itself, making that kind of I don't know what you call it, like sort of like an anchor port, like one of their main ports when it comes to awesome cruise ships. Utopia of the Seas, that sails out of Port Canaveral. So we're going to be going for our DawgNation cruise. That's a cool, really big deal. But also coming up later on this summer, you got the debut of Star of the Seas. That'll be the newest in the Icon class of ships. So it's going to be a massive deal when it debuts. It's also going to be sailing out of Port Canaveral. And now that we're in 2025, all of that stuff is like right here. It's sort of the next thing to happen here. Get the debut of the brand new beach club opening up at Paradise Island, the Bahamas. That's going to be awesome. So there's so many fun things on tap. We can't wait to tell you all about it. Jessica Slater, in fact, terrific travel agent, especially selected for us by Royal Caribbean. She can talk to you about that, all the great entertainment options on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship and all the really cool ships on their way here. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She can get you set up for a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, including our DawgNation cruise taking place in April of 2025. All right, a couple of stories here. Yesterday, something interesting happened. Adam Schefter, who, to be honest with you, I take everything from Schefter with a grain of salt just because so much of that is seemingly, best I can tell, sort of fed to him, by agents, things like that. So usually there is a ulterior motive for anyone who gives him information. I don't say that maliciously. It's just kind of the way that business goes. Anyway, so Schefter on TV yesterday was kind of talking about, this is what you typically call it, like Black Monday around the NFL. A lot of coaches get fired. I can certainly think of a coaching staff that probably deserves to be, but that's a different topic for a different show. So you have all the kinds of coaching movement around the NFL. One of the things that Schefter said on ESPN yesterday was, don't be surprised if Texas coach Steve Sarkisian gets some overtures from the NFL. And I was thinking about that. Honestly, I don't, care much about Sarkisian in the NFL. That's not that interesting to me. But the fact that Sarkisian's getting this kind of chatter, I think it does sort of speak to something. I'm going to just sort of mention this briefly here. We began the year saying, boy, Kirby Smart's the number one coach in college football, and the gap between him and whoever's next, it's never been wider in terms of the group of coaches kind of considered to be near the top. And one of the questions we asked a lot in 2024 leading the start of the season was how long that was likely to be true, and would there be other coaches this season that could kind of move their way towards the top of the coaching ranks. This is not, any disservice to Kirby, who I think is still the best coach in college football, but it is certainly true other coaches have sort of worked their way towards a little closer to being in that status with Kirby Smart. And I think one of those is Steve Sarkisian. I'm no Texas fan. I don't know that I'm a Sarkisian fan necessarily. I certainly won't be rooting for Texas in the playoff with any sense of SEC pride. I don't find that to be a very easy program to root for necessarily, but I'm also not a liar. And I do think that Steve Sarkisian, over the course of the last couple of years, has taken a step forward in terms of how he's viewed as a coach. These NFL overtures supposedly being described by Adam Schefter, I think, are an example of that. Only one program in America has been in the Final Four 2 years in a row. Texas last year, Texas this year. They're the only team to be in the Final Four 2 years in a row. That Steve Sarkisian, Kirby Smart's still the best coach because he's won 2 national championships. Steve Sarkisian is a lot closer to that elite category. He's sort of joined those ranks, and these NFL rumors, perhaps more evidence of that. I think you can also talk about Dan Lanning, who needed some big wins, and this year at least got them to the point of an undefeated regular season, a Big Ten championship, ultimately lost the playoff. But that's a pretty big step forward for Lanning as a coach. I think he's solidified his status, probably improved on his reputation. Obviously, you got to say that Marcus Freeman kind of did some stuff has certainly earned more credit for how he coached against Georgia the other night. He seems like he's in that category of, elite young coaches on the rise here. So to begin the calendar year, we sort of thought Kirby's the best coach in college football. The gap between him and the next best coaches seemed really wide. Kirby's still at the top, and there's probably still some distance between him and the other guys. But Sark and Freeman and Lanning, some of these guys did sort of inch their way up that hierarchy when it comes to their coaching reputations. Did you see where the five-star wide receiver, former five-star Mike Matthews, after all kinds of chatter that he might go in the transfer portal, has now stayed at Tennessee? Now, I've said this before. This sort of speaks to the complication that exists for fans when it comes to following transfer news, that every story's got like 4 headlines. It's so-and-so player's rumored to go to the portal, so-and-so player's expected to go in the portal, and then either so-and-so player did go in the portal and now he's going to this place, or he didn't go to the portal, now he's staying here. Like every story's got like 3 or 4 headlines. It's sometimes hard to follow. Matthews was maybe going into the portal. Tennessee seems like it's kind of stepped up to kind of keep him there, which I think in a way does kind of speak about the Georgia Zachariah Branch thing. Because I'm going to tell you right now, Matthews is a player that I've always loved. I'm not a scout, don't pretend to be. But in high school, I really, really liked Mike Matthews, and I interviewed him a couple times. He seemed like a really good dude, the best that I could tell, too. Like, Matthews is the sort of guy that I would have loved to have had at Georgia, but he didn't go to the portal. He wasn't available. So, therefore, you're going to talk about Zachariah Branch, and some people are going to say, and I want to make sure we give full, picture. Some people are going to say that from a stat line standpoint, Branch hasn't done very much. And I would say that, in totality, what is he about? 800 and something receiving yards in total in 2 years in college. For a guy that was a 5-star coming out of high school, that's not a robust stat line. I think that's probably fair. That he could come to Georgia and just not do very much. Sometimes that's going to happen. But when you look at the other guys who are out there, now there's still the guy from Texas A&M who I think is a really interesting prospect. And Georgia could be a factor there. When you look at the other kind of receivers that are out there and, kind of what's in the portal right now, you bring in Branch, you perhaps use that money to bring, he and his brother in, or you sort of don't bring him in at all and, you end up not really using that money for anything necessarily. So, perhaps this is a little bit of a, I don't necessarily want to call it a reach for Georgia, but maybe it's a little bit of a flyer. You're going to take a flyer on a guy that's got real talent but perhaps hasn't sort of had the stat line that matches that. I would say it's probably worth the risk given the fact that a guy like Matthews didn't come in. And you probably still have the budget to go after the guy from Texas A&M if that's what you want to do. That you've got some options here, but why not take a flyer on this? Because if it doesn't work, there's very little. It's not like you are taking money that you would have spent on something else or someone else to bring in the Branch brothers. This is money that if you don't spend it here, you're probably not spending it all. So why not just go out there and take a shot on somebody like this, especially given the fact that Matthews is staying at Tennessee. And then finally there's this. Interesting when you look at the recent movement of quarterbacks where like Mendoza, the guy from Cal, allegedly reportedly took a visit to Georgia before going to Indiana. And, that decision to leave Cal opened up the door. Do you remember Jaron, and I always probably butcher this last name, Sagapulatele, the quarterback who had gone to Oregon, who also had sort of had a little bit of late interest from UGA, it seemed like anyway. Well, now he's going to take Mendoza's spot there at Cal. You've got this movement among quarterbacks there around, sort of a lot of this centered around Berkeley, California, but also in a weird way kind of tying back to Georgia somewhat too. I think that's interesting. I do think it speaks to, especially in light of the Rashada news I was talking to our buddy Jon Stinchcomb about a little earlier, is that Georgia, I think, would like to have another quarterback in its quarterback room for competition and for depth. My assumption has always been it's not quite so much like the sort of Mendoza category of someone who is probably going to go to Indiana and start and, would have assumed to be a starting quarterback wherever he would have gone. But, I like what I saw from Gunnar Stockton in the Sugar Bowl. We'll talk more about Gunnar in the days to come, too. I like what I saw from Gunnar in the Sugar Bowl. I think that Gunnar Stockton is your starting quarterback for next year here at UGA. I think they would like to have something else in the quarterback room to go along with that, especially given the fact that Rashada's not going to be here anymore. And so when you see Sakabutula-Tele, moving around and Mendoza moving around, both these quarterbacks at time have had some, I guess, little ties into Georgia. I think it sort of speaks to that Georgia, had something that it was kind of looking for. Can it find it in this sort of window prior to the start of the winter semester? Are they thinking about something for the very brief portal window that opens up in the spring? One way or another, Georgia could still look to, I think, sort of bolster its quarterback depth. But if I had to guess, I don't believe they're looking for a replacement for Gunnar Stockton. I believe they wanted Stockton to be their starter next season, and the way that he played in the Sugar Bowl, I think for the most part, reinforces that belief on the part of UGA. We will make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. So also, before you get ready to wrap things up here today, let me give a little bit of a shout out for Georgia basketball. Obviously did not win SEC opener against Ole Miss. I watched this game. It's kind of funny. You can tell that Georgia basketball is a lot more on the radar than it was because this one is one of those things where, I was sort of waiting for the game on Saturday at noon, tuned in, ready to watch it, very, very plugged into this. Given the fact that Georgia has had such a good start to its conference season, I think essentially the best in history. You got to go back to the 1930s to see Georgia getting off to this kind of start in the season. It would have been nice to win the SEC opener, of course, but we also understand, and anybody who follows college basketball, the Georgia schedule in terms of all the ranked teams they're playing in the SEC to kind of begin their conference slate is really tough. And we've said this before, that even with Georgia being better than it's been, the SEC as a league may also be better than it's been. So there's not going to be any easy gimme wins in the SEC here right now. I, for the most part, took some positives, though, from that loss to Ole Miss. I thought Georgia played really good defense. The one thing I think you would like to see more of is they were clearly shooting the ball terribly, just shooting it awfully. And you'd like to see them kind of find a little bit more in the way of points in the paint, get the ball down to Newell in the paint around the low block, try to find a way to get some easier baskets. Newell got a nice steal near the end of the half and got a dunk to give Georgia a 2-point lead going into halftime. And I thought that might be kind of a big play in that game. But the truth is, in the second half, Ole Miss probably just did a little bit more offensively than Georgia was capable of doing. But I certainly didn't see anything from that game, tough loss on the road, to make me change my mind. I think this is still a really good Georgia basketball team, but the SEC itself is also going to be really good too and really, really challenging. So wanted to give you that update there. And with that, we'll get ready to wrap things up here today. By the way, if you have not signed up yet for our DawgNation newsletter, I'm going to stay up to date with Mike White's basketball team, all the other stuff going on around Georgia. The DawgNation newsletter that I'm a part of, we're doing a good job with that, having some fun with that. Make sure you check that out. Go to DawgNation.com/newsletter. You can sign up for that and get the best of DawgNation delivered right there to your email inbox every single day. DawgNation.com/newsletter for more on that. I think you're going to really like that. It's a really fun thing in a great way. Honestly, I've gotten great feedback on this thus far. People seem to really like it. So check out DawgNation.com/newsletter for more on that. You can sign up and have it delivered to you. We've done a newsletter for a while. This is sort of an upgraded version of that newsletter, kind of a fresh new initiative on that. So make sure you check that out. Golden Shoe, had met a lot of great folks in New Orleans. A lot of fun, including Cassandra Turner, who wrote into us to say, meeting BA in New Orleans was a highlight, she says. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us and take a pic. She says, just as friendly and cool as we expect. Well, I'll tell you what, that's an incredible compliment. I don't know that I'm deserving of that, but Cassandra, I really appreciate you saying that. And by the way, it's kind of cool that Cassandra does say that because I guess back in Indianapolis, going back to the national championship a couple years ago, I had promised her a T-shirt. I did not deliver on that promise. So the fact that she is still so nice about that is an incredibly cool thing. So Cassandra, I appreciate that. It was great to see you in New Orleans and great to meet a lot of folks there in New Orleans. Obviously, there were some challenging times that you're very well aware of, but still a lot of really cool Georgia fans and a great experience getting a chance to hang out and meet so many of them, including Cassandra. I really appreciate that. Lousy, stinking Gators. How about our Gator hater updater? Now, listen, Georgia's not winning a national championship this year, but it's still got plenty of bragging rights over its rivals, including these lousy, stinking Gators. We love that. It's been 1,521 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. We celebrate that, and we close out our show by saying it. It's our Gator hater updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews School Down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs, they show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. We're going to get some of your comments here. We're going to find out what's on everybody's mind, at least for a few minutes. So Christian Miller coming back, Zachariah and Zion Branch coming in. Georgia also expected to lose some more guys too. So we're just going to try to cover all that news and see if we can do that. Let's see what else. Stephen Wainwright says Georgia has to be careful that the players they get out of the portal represent the university in the right way. And, yeah, I do know that's the case. I do know that that's something they take seriously. Obviously, a couple of the guys who've had issues at Georgia have been portal players. That's certainly true. But I do believe that Georgia wants to take that part of the vetting process seriously. I believe that's the case, Stephen. I think that's a good point. Let's see what else. Jonathan Aaron says, sorry about calling you and your hair out on Thursday at the Superdome. But anyways, how many more people do you think will go into the portal and any surprises? It is true that for whatever reason, listen, I'm also a lot grayer than I used to be. But that Superdome lighting is just bad. It's dark in there, and that makes my hair look so gray. Trust me, I have thought about that before and noticed that before. As far as the portal stuff, surprise-wise, I don't know. Sheer number-wise, there's obviously more of that coming. In this day and age, I also don't even know what we even count as a surprise. It's all just so crazy. So, yeah, I mean, but there's more of that coming, certainly. You know, Georgia did a good job of kind of keeping that at bay prior to the game, but there's only so much you can do about that here right now. Gary Roach writes in to say, my condolences for Kirby Smart and his family. BA, I think that Georgia's going on the hunt next season. I like what Christian Miller said to you during his interview and said about him coming back. Yeah, we will probably re-rack the Miller interview tomorrow in light of him coming back because I think that's an important figure to have back on this team for next season. I think you're right about that. I do think you're right about that. And look, it's always sort of easy to sell the notion of unfinished business in a year when you didn't win the championship. But one of the things, if I can just sort of find some time this week, I want to talk about, I just feel like there's so much we've got to do right now. One of the things I want to try to do is I think the people who are using the Notre Dame loss by Georgia, and it was disappointing. Georgia had not lost a non-conference game in 6 years. So anytime you can lose that prestige, of course it's disappointing. I mean, it's devastated. I don't like losing games to these Midwest teams. I'm sorry, I don't. There's just a sort of a sense of like regional pride that exists for me in college football. It just does. And I don't like losing games to teams like this. But at the same time, some of what we're hearing on the other side of this loss from like national media types, it's nonsense. Like it is patented nonsense. And we're going to talk about that because I think we need to, for sure. Lewis Sutherland says we need to concentrate on the decline of the offensive line over the last few years. It's no doubt going to be a hot topic. Now, is it the last few years or is it just this year? I mean, did we not think the Georgia offensive line in 2023 is pretty good? And they had a bad game against Alabama probably in the SEC championship, but that was a pretty good year for the offensive line, right? Maybe I'm not remembering correctly, but it seems like it was. But this year is clearly a big issue. Let's see what else. Let me go back to DawgNation.com for a minute. SEM Dog says, I accused the lady who cuts my hair of stripping all the color out of my hair and thinning it out on top at the same time. To be totally honest with you, I've had like a version of that too, where like, I mean, just dumb. But like one day I like felt the back of my head and I really did think the lady who cut my hair cut it wrong. It's like, what, did she just shave off half my head? It's like, no, that's not, she didn't do that. God did that. And like, I remember exactly where I was when I realized that I had to stop blaming the lighting for my hair looking so gray. I remember this. And if I wasn't like on camera and stuff like that, I probably wouldn't care. It's just one of those things where when you're on camera, you can't help but be a little bit vain. And vanity is not an attractive, personality trait. But, as I'm looking to you in the camera, I'm like seeing myself in like two big monitors right here. So it's like you're looking in the mirror all the time, or at least some version of that, and you're also realizing that everybody's sort of judging you by how you look. So you can't help but be a little bit vain probably. But I definitely remember where I was when I realized, hold on, that's not the lighting that's making me look gray, although sometimes lighting does make me look grayer than I am. That's just kind of how I look. I will say this, like I can't do much about the gray or the bald spot. But Kaylee says I look terrific. I'll let the haters get me down. I will say this though, like I'm fatter than I've been in like years, so that's something I can do something about. So we'll see how the new year goes in that regard. The hair though that's sort of what it is right now. Let us see what else. DT says you can't get excited about UGA basketball until they have several games, SEC games to book. Yeah, I mean, like for me though, this is a team worth being excited about because they are going to be competitive, but none of these wins are guaranteed. They got to play, like they go on the road to Oxford, and this week they got to play Kentucky at home. What is that, tomorrow? Is that tomorrow? Tuesday or Wednesday? Tomorrow? And Kentucky just scored, did they score 100 points against Florida? Like, so, I mean, good luck with that. Mark Pope's done a pretty good job with that team thus far. So I like college basketball. I'm glad to see Georgia be more competitive, but you got to be honest, being more competitive in this SEC right now doesn't guarantee anything. Senior Dog 54 enjoyed John's take on the offensive line. Yeah, John's usually pretty candid about stuff like that. So I was glad to get him on that today too. UJ Marine says the SEC slate in basketball is brutal this year. It is. It's a very good league. It's a very good league. Really is. Let me get Facebook for a moment. Let's see how they're doing. Feels good to be back in studio. Show is just so much easier to do in studio. Just everything just feels normal. Miriam Corbin says I'm aging well. That's good to know. I appreciate that, Miriam. Thank you very much. Steve Schaffini takes it even farther than that. Steve, I appreciate that too. I appreciate that, Steve. Let's see what else. Jason Tompkins and Daniel Wells bringing up Todd Monken. Did y'all see the stat on Monken? He got the game ball, I guess, of the day. Help me out with this. What was the story that they had a 4,000-yard passer and a 3,000 yards rushing? Is that right? Is that what they did this year? Part of the issue that you have with the Georgia offense right now is the comparison to, Todd Monken's just one of the most diabolical minds I think that there exists. Monken was a great offensive coordinator, And almost anyone's going to suffer in comparison to that. He was just really, really sharp. Wendell Brewer says Todd's killing the NFL. He really is. Really is. Eric DeVorci says his brother's interviewing for a big job today. That's awesome. Yeah, listen, that's really cool. Best of luck to him, and I hope all that goes really well. That's great to hear. Great to hear. Let's see what else. Brian Whitaker asking about Colby Young. I just think it's way too early to know. Young has been practicing with Georgia. We had the video of that the other day. So there's obviously some chance that's true, and maybe there's a good chance that's true. The sense that I get, and gosh knows, some of this, perhaps the read is wrong on, but the sense that I get is that people thought he'd get his charges dropped, and then he didn't. And I can't really speak to why that was or whether or not that was sort of falsely construed to begin with? I don't know. But the sense that I got is that people kind of thought the charges would be dropped, and then all of a sudden that just really, really changed. But if he comes back, that's a pretty – and also, like, you know, I can't really get involved with, like, the legal part of that. I don't know. But I think based on my read of the news on that, I think I probably thought he was going to get his charges dropped too. So, you know, it could be that having those charges dropped is an example of, you know, justice being done. That even from a personal standpoint, that's what should happen. Maybe we'll find out new information that changes our feeling on that. I guess I'm going to withhold all judgment on that because it's not really the world that I live in. But apart from that, from a strictly football standpoint, I mean, him returning would give Georgia seemingly more of what it needs. Matt Rukavina on the subject, he says, when it comes to the people defending Mike Bobo, they would say, how dare you question Kirby? But also when it comes to the Bobo defenders, they would say that Kirby's talent pool sucks and he needs to do better. Look, I do realize the Mike Bobo thing is a very hot topic, and I promise you this. We are not going to sidestep that as an issue because we're not doing our job as the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans if we're not reflecting the conversation that fans are having. And that is the conversation that fans are having. It just is. My opinion on that is that when you look at what's at issue with Georgia, clearly the offensive line is going to be better than it was against Notre Dame and better than it was this season. So that is, I think, an unavoidable part of this topic. But when you get to the Bobo part of this, and I think that Matt kind of lays it out well about the sort of twin pillars of discussion, I am of the belief, many of you disagree, and that's why we read comments and take calls and all the things that we do to give other voices a chance to be heard. But I am of the belief that if Georgia did have better talent, more productive talent within its sort of pass-catching ranks, I don't think there's anything wrong with the Georgia offense. So if that makes me a Bobo defender, I guess I'm okay wearing that label. I think the one thing I want to be clear about, though, is I did not think the Georgia offense was good enough this year. I did not think it was. Did not think the Georgia offense was good enough. But my fix for that would be, hey, let's find a way to make the players that are either bringing in or the players you have, let's find a way to make them a little bit more, productive. And at that point, I think the Georgia offense is going to be a lot better because even if like half the drops this year have been converted into catches, that's a really different looking Georgia statistical profile that on its own. And statistically, the Georgia offense in 2023 was among the best in the country. Not that way this year, but they were pretty good in 2023. The one big knock, though, that is going to exist on Bobo going forward compared to Todd Monken is that Monken's offenses were seemingly at their best in the biggest games. Obviously the 2022 postseason when they ran through LSU 50 points, Ohio State 40 points, 40-plus points, TCU 65 points, the best example of that. Well, in sort of, postseason games, the last couple of years, only 24 against Alabama in the 2023 SEC championship. Only 10 points in total against Notre Dame in the playoff here this year. I would say that the Texas SEC championship, a little bit of an asterisk because you lost your starting quarterback at halftime. But I think the one criticism that right now really sticks to Coach Bobo is the fact that the offense hasn't really shown up in the postseason games. That's the one criticism that really sticks to him. And that does stand in sharp contrast to Todd Monken. But, overall, Georgia had a really good offense in total in 2023. And I think there's the potential for better in 2025. Steve Rogers says, what about the rush offense? I don't recall one long run for a touchdown. The truth is Georgia hasn't had that in forever. And that's the one thing that seemingly got worse for Georgia under Todd Monken. And by getting worse, what I really mean is that production was sort of displaced to something else. for the last, pretty much for the last 5 seasons, Georgia essentially has thrown it better than it's run it. And that is not what you sort of think of typically with Georgia. But from Monken forward, that's kind of what Georgia's been, a better passing team than running team. They haven't had great rushing stats since DeAndre Swift left. And I don't know why that is. I would suspect that some of that is, for as much as this has been kind of a joke, I don't think Georgia wide receivers block like they used to. The blocks down the field where you are, open up big holes and kind of creating the explosive runs, Georgia just does less of that than it used to, I think. And so I think that's part of the reason why explosive runs and things like that, Georgia just doesn't have very many of these anymore. They used to have a lot of them, but in the transition to being a little bit more pass first, I would say that the overall offensive performance has gotten better. So maybe it was a trade worth making. Let me go around the rest of the comments one more time, then we'll get ready to go. RKD says it's insane how you could drop all those passes and still be playing. That's on Kirby. He let the room basically, regression. Clearly he takes the ultimate responsibility for it because it's his team. And the drops were a huge problem, and it was. It's a huge problem. Lewis Sutherland also kind of pointing back to the offensive line. Look, that's the one thing. I think it's talking about with the running game. So I would say that like the difference between like a 7-yard run and a 17-yard run is not the offensive line. Pretty much anybody who kind of gets into football will say that's a combination of the back himself for what he does at the second level, and what may happen for a block down the field, oftentimes from a wide receiver. The difference between, like, say, a 3-yard run and a 5-yard run, that's all offensive line. Now, almost none of that's running back. But from once you kind of get past that sort of 5-yard run, now you're sort of thinking about the running back himself and maybe another block kind of in that third level of the defense. But I get the point you're saying. Jack Fullerton says maybe conservative play is too conservative at Georgia. But let's think about this for a second, Jack. The Georgia offense this season probably wasn't what it needed to be. But would you say that it was conservative? Most people kind of ripped Georgia after the Sugar Bowl for being too aggressive at the end of the first half, especially. Like, whatever the Georgia issue was, it wasn't too conservative, right? People say that, well, they threw too many screen passes, for instance, which maybe is a little bit of a conservative throw. But, they also had a lot of what I kind of describe as the sort of heave and hope stuff, where you're just, launching the ball down the field and hoping somebody can make a play on a 50-50 ball. Like, that's not always, particularly, efficient either. So whatever the Georgia offensive issues were, and perhaps people agree with you, and if they do, they should weigh in. But I don't know that I would chalk it up as to being too conservative, because oftentimes they're pretty aggressive. And they went for it on 4th down a lot, I think. RKD says that Monken will never come back to college. Yeah, that'll never happen. Georgia was lucky to have him for 3 years. And Georgia did a good job of maximizing him while he was here. You had pandemic year. And by the way, y'all go back and look at some of the 2020 numbers. The 2020 numbers are pretty interesting because Georgia was playing only SEC teams. Georgia played no non-conference games that year in the regular season. They played nothing but SEC teams and a top 10 ranked Cincinnati team in the bowl team. And Georgia's numbers offensively were way better in 2020 than they had been the previous year, despite the fact they were playing a much more difficult schedule. Monken showed you in 2020 what he was, with, Stetson Bennett kind of coming in from nowhere to be the starting quarterback. Georgia was still a better team offensively than it had been. That was foreshadowing what would come. But the point is that, and I only barely know the story on this, but it seems like Monken in Cleveland, when he was with the Browns, had rubbed some people the wrong way. And like I said, take all of this with a grain of salt. There's a chance I don't really know. But it certainly seems like Monken had made some people mad. And perhaps because of that, for a little while, Monken was not going to be hireable. That I think the league sort of was, the assumption I get was sort of asking him to sort of sit out a hiring cycle or two because, I think he was disgruntled in Cleveland. He wasn't calling the plays. Was it? I get all half the facts wrong on this, but I think that Monken was kind of on the outs in the NFL, and so he had to go do a little career rehabilitation and came to college to do so. And boy, did he do it! He called brilliant plays for Georgia. They won 2 national championships, and he was gone. And he would have been back in the NFL as quick as he could have been. But I think he probably had to wait a little while because I think he made some people mad. There was some reporting on this at the time. I'm not making this up. But now he's back in, and my gosh, I mean, you got to think he's going to be a candidate for some head coaching jobs now, right? I mean, he's really, he's probably the best offensive coordinator John Harbaugh's ever had, right? Greg Roman was his guy for a long time before that. Am I right about that? Maybe I'm getting that confused. Maybe that was Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman. I think it probably was. The point is, this is a brilliant, offensive mind for John Harbaugh. You've got to think that he's going to be in the mix for some head coaching jobs, you might think. Let's see what else. Draco says that Monken made people in Cleveland mad because he knows football. None of the rest of them do. That very well could have been the case. You may be right about that. This is a good question. Lewis Sutherland says, do you think that Georgia should try to do more to get the average fan to donate to NIL like Ole Miss does? They are killing it with NIL. So I think there are 2 things about that question. Thing number 1 is to my understanding, you are right. Ole Miss has done a great job with its NIL. And we were at Vaught-Hemingway Stadium earlier this fall. And NIL is sort of a part of everything they do. Like, for instance, if you go to the bathroom has like the QR code to like click to like make a donation. Like everywhere you go in the stadium, the idea of NIL is reinforced. And frankly, I've not always been the biggest Lane Kiffin fan. Many of you know this. There's a lot about Kiffin I don't like. I just be totally honest. But Kiffin has definitely enhanced his profile as a professional by how he has energized Ole Miss around raising money. They have raised money, and they have spent it seemingly pretty well. Now, if all those – that's not a guaranteed thing either because if, say your transfers get injured, then your season's over with. So, they had some things sort of break right for them here this year. But you make case that – there's no team in the Final Four that I don't think Ole Miss could beat. Now, I'm not saying they would beat them all, but there's no team in the Final Four that you would say, no way Ole Miss could beat them, including Ohio State, by the way. I think I have this right, that Ole Miss, I think, even though they lost 3 times, has actually spent the fewest amount of time this season trailing. Like, Ole Miss was really, really good, and they were really, really good because of the players they bought. So from that standpoint, they have done really well. Should Georgia be doing more of that? I think you can make a case probably it should. I'm a big believer, though. The one thing that we're missing right now is what I think of as like the really creative NIL idea. I think that there's a real opportunity to not just ask people for money because there's only so much blood you're going to squeeze from a stone. At a certain point, people have given all they can give, whether it be a rich person or like a medium person or like a, just sort of an average fan. At a certain point, people have given all they can give. But I do believe there's an opportunity for Georgia, I think, to be a little bit more creative with NIL. And that's one of the things I would hope to see. And I've got, some of my own ideas on that. But as of right now, I'm not going to share them. All right, let's see what else. We got to get ready to go here. Thomas Tyson says that Monken's not going to be out scheming anybody if you've got players dropping passes. I do think there's an interesting thing to be addressed with this, which is Georgia has, in the Kirby Smart era, had 3, statistically speaking, 3 truly elite level offenses. Like 40 points per game, among the best in yards per play. there have been 3 truly elite offenses at Georgia: 2021, 2022, and 2023. Statistically speaking, those are by far the best offenses in the Kirby Smart era. Well, guess what all 3 of those teams had in common? The presence of Brock Bowers, one of the best players in the history of this program, one of the 2, 3, or 4 best players in the history of this program. So I do think it's fair to wonder, okay, well, and you just heard me, heap praise on Todd Monk, and I believe deservedly so. But there was also a very easy answer there with Brock Bowers. And, prior to injury, Bobo was getting about as much out of Bowers as Monken was. I do think it's fair to wonder, can the Georgia offense be elite without Brock Bowers? Because it really wasn't before that. It was good, but not elite. And this year, without Brock Bowers, it wasn't elite either. It was sort of back to feeling like it felt in 2018 and 2019, if we're just being honest. So I do think that how you play without a player like Brock Bowers is still a really tough question for Georgia to answer. I think that's true. Tennis Girl checking out. Tennis, we appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. RKD says, I think it would revitalize the fan base and the players if Georgia got a new offensive coordinator. Maybe it would, but as I mentioned before, and I promise I'm going to do more of this in the show at some point in time. I just don't want to do it today. I'm going to be as candid with all of you as I can. As I said before, I don't think that Georgia had a great year offensively this year. I don't think it did. And thinking about all the ways which you could improve that is an appropriate conversation to be had. But y'all, let's just be real about this. 2 years ago, Kirby finished off back-to-back national championships. You get something for winning. Otherwise, there's no point in winning. And it's not money, because everybody gets paid a lot of money. The thing that you get for winning championships is quality of life. You buy yourself the freedom not to have to listen to the critics. And if Kirby had not won 2 national championships, then what people were saying about Mike Bobo or saying about whatever else, you probably have to sit there and listen to that a little bit more. And maybe you've got somebody close to you who's like kind of nudging you in a certain direction. But given the success that Georgia has enjoyed, no matter how bad the performance of one assistant coach might be, given the success that Georgia's enjoyed, if for a little while longer, if Kirby Smart does not want to listen to that, he does not have to. And y'all, I'm just telling you the truth. This is how life works. This is how sports work. That if 2 years removed from winning 2 national championships, Kirby's going to be forced because of, kind of mob rule to fire his best friend in disgrace, then what's the point of winning 2 national championships? Now, you may not want to hear that, but that's just it. That is just it. That the success that Kirby has enjoyed has bought him some time to do things the way that he wants to do it. And if after next year, assuming that most of the coaches return, if after next year it hasn't gotten better, well, all of a sudden now it's a little bit of a different conversation, because now you're a little bit farther removed and, the whatever. But for right now, after an SEC championship year, in a game you won with your backup quarterback, 2 years removed from 2 straight national championships, while we all have a right to share our opinions, and I try to be as open as I can for all of you to share your opinions, if Kirby Smart does not want to listen to any of this, and if he wants to tell us all to go kick rocks, he's got the freedom to do that. And if other people don't tell you that, they're lying to you. This is that Kirby Smart's got the freedom to run this program his way for a little while, because that's what you get when you win 2 national championships. Chef Jay Bowen says, I don't see anybody making Kirby Smart do anything he doesn't want to do. That doesn't last forever. You know what I'm saying? Like eventually accountability sort of comes for everyone. I mean, eventually that's the case. But let's also be honest, going back to 2023, the overall offensive stat line for Georgia actually looks pretty good. And, I do think, Georgia could have made some real noise in that playoff that year. It was not a great game against Alabama, but it was a really good offensive season. And I just told you before, I think there's a chance there's a much better offensive performance here in 2025. If it's not, then I think the conversation changes. But y'all, Georgia is in a run of unprecedented program success. And it's fair to say, well, yeah, but the performance regressed this year compared to what it has been. That's a fair thing to say, and we're going to provide platform for people to say that. But it is just not realistic to say the response to that is going to be some sort of house cleaning that would, like some sort of like house cleaning type response to something like that. Not for a coach that had this kind of success. He doesn't have to do that if he doesn't want to. Whether he's made good coaching hires or not, he is not under any pressure to make sort of panic replacements here. He's just not. Craig Wade says how much of the Bobo hire was on Kirby as opposed to the University of Georgia, because the Bobo name rings loud in Athens. A lot of people love him. I mean, I think that we talked earlier about Kirby Smart being a family man, and I think he really is. I think you'd also make the case that Kirby Smart values his friendships. So I do believe that Kirby wanted to coach with his very good friend. I think, and Muschamp the other side on defense. Example of that too. I think that Kirby Smart likes the idea of coaching with people he knows well and trusts. I think that he does. I think that once again, Kirby has probably earned it to do it his way. Now that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to work out exactly how you want it to. Maybe it won't. And if that's the case, then eventually, things will probably change. But on the basis of just this year, given what has happened prior to that, and given the fact that this year in itself was an SEC championship year, I don't believe there's any pressure to make any kind of move that Smart doesn't want to make. Now, if guys decide they themselves want to retire, they themselves want to move on, maybe the pressure's uncomfortable for them personally, we could see a couple of coaches or a coach or whatever. We could see somebody make a decision on their own. But this is still an incredibly successful program, and that success buys you something in the way of quality of life. Let's see what else. Let me go back. We got to go. It's so late. Golly, it's been a long show. Michael Newberry, first of all, happy birthday to you, and thank you for the kind words. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you sharing your birthday with us here today, and thanks for being with us for a long time, and that's awesome to hear. A lot of folks have been kind of hanging around for a long time around here, and I certainly appreciate that. Michael, happy birthday to you. Matt Rukavina says that he feels like the fans are still allowed to say what they're going to say. I totally think that. I would say have at it. And we're going to try to be as honest as we can be on both sides of this. I'm going to be honest about why I think that Georgia may move a little slower on some of this kind of stuff than some of y'all want it to. I'll be honest about that. But at the same time, Matt, you're a good fan. You're a sharp guy. You've watched this team closely for a long time. I got no problem with people pointing out, whatever. I mean, look, I'm not going to stand in the way of anybody exercising their right to share their viewpoint. And in many of these cases, a lot of the critical fans may be correct. They very well might be. So, like I said, we're going to try to have as open and honest a conversation we possibly can have. Garrison Tucker says it's the quickest season I've ever experienced. It flew by. Really, really has. And, I think I've said this, like, there are games in the schedule that I don't even remember. Like the Auburn game, for instance. I've referenced that a couple of times. I don't have any memory of that game. Crazy how quick it's all gone by. Trippy Charlie says on Bobo, it says, does Georgia win the SEC championship game with a healthy Bowers and McConkey? I think so. They would likely have won the national championship as well. Yeah, I mean, I do have a suspicion that Trippy is right about this, and that I've always sort of felt like that Bobo as an offensive coordinator is probably better than the reputation suggests. and I'm just going to leave it at that. I've always sort of felt like some of the criticism of him is probably unfair, not all of it. There was a lot about Georgia this year that needs to be better. But in his first year as OC last year, I mean, the results were really good. Not good enough in the SEC championship, but also missing your two most important offensive weapons. I think that's right. All right, we got to go. Gosh, it's 11:50. All right, hey, y'all check out Pella Window and Door of Georgia, of course, but also our friends R.S. Andrews. Online, rsandrews.com. Mention cold weather. Get your heating system tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Find them online there, rsandrews.com. I promise y'all, we'll talk about it all. And I'm going to give platform and voice to people who feel differently than me, and we'll just be as candid as we possibly can about how Georgia gets better. But I did say this off the top of the show. I'm a lot more optimistic today than I was a couple of days ago. And, well, I guess we'll find out together if that was justifiable optimism or not, but that is the way that I feel for now. So y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Happy New Year. We'll look forward to talking to you then.